which ancient culture was way more dug up than most people know. Story 1. The ancient Assyrians built a vast empire. The empire reached its height during the Neo-Assyrian era, from 911 BC to the fall of its largest city Nineveh in 612 BC. The Assyrian dominion, stretching from Egypt to modern-day Iraq, controlled richly diverse cultures. To quash any uprising in these conquered areas, Assyrian leaders utilized extreme violence. Their horrific campaigns were celebrated in stone reliefs festooning the palace walls. They created tablets containing every single punishment the Assyrian army carried out. They cut off the limbs, gouged out the eyes, and then left those poor victims to roam around. Those poor people serve as a living reminder of the Assyrians' cruelty. The Assyrians were proud of the mass executions. The victim's skin was hung on the city wall. The brutality of the Assyrians was extreme, even for the ancient standards of cruelty. Story 2. Feudal China was super into burying people alive. Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor responsible for the unification of China, upon his death, had 70,000 concubines, servants, and workers forcibly interred alongside him. The terracotta army was constructed only because murdering all the soldiers as well wasn't an option. Story 3. The Ptolemaic rulers of Egypt were 10 generations of absolutely ducked, bookended by 2 actually good leaders, Ptolemy and Cleopatra. Their family history would make for a fun trashy soap opera, full of backstabbing, famicide, and a truly appalling amount of incest, as they spent 200 years running Egypt into the ground. Too bad it was all real. And yes, Cleopatra was one of history's few inbreeding success stories. She managed to get all the best traits of her insane family, and none of the bad ones. If you've got a little time, listening to Bluetos lose his mind trying to describe the Ptolemaic kingdom is hilarious. Story 4. Sparta. Sparta has a reputation as no-nonsense badasses who dedicated their lives to become ultimate warriors. People know they were ruthless and had slaves, but the total depravity and sheer stupidity of Sparta eludes common knowledge. Sparta was an extremely oppressive state where a small elite enslaved 90+% of society and killed them for sport. But being in the elite wasn't much better. The education system was pure abuse and produced traumatized close-minded men incapable of anything else except heaping the same brutality on the next generation. The elite Spartiate class was a closed class. You couldn't become one, no matter of your services to Sparta, but it was possible to lose Spartiate status. The Spartiate class became smaller and smaller as the years went on, eventually becoming too weak to keep Sparta alive. And all this didn't even produce better soldiers. Historian Brett Devereaux has an essay series on Sparta on his blog. Highly recommended for people interested in ancient history. From the conclusion, and I want to stress this one last time, because I know there are so many people who would pardon all of Sparta's ills if it meant that it created superlative soldiers. It did not. Spartan soldiers were average. The horror of the Spartan system, the nastiness of the agoge, the oppression of the helots, the regimentation of daily life, it was all for nothing. Worse yet, it created a Spartan leadership class that seemed incapable of thinking its way around even basic problems. All of that supposedly cool stuff made Sparta weaker, not stronger. Sparta was, if you will permit the comparison, an ancient North Korea. An over-militarized, paranoid state which was able only to protect its own systems of internal brutality, and which added only oppression to the sum of the human experience. Little more than an extraordinarily effective prison, metastasized to the level of a state. There is nothing of redeeming value here. Sparta is not something to be emulated. It is a cautionary tale. Story 5. I was recently stunned by the amount of atrocities the Japanese Empire has done. Mutilation of babies, forcing kids to rape their mothers, putting mothers into chambers with boiling grounds to test them if they would put their kids on the ground so that they don't get their feet scorched by stepping on their bodies, carrying baby corpses on bayonets, not to mention carving a hole in the belly of pregnant women to rip fetuses cold-blooded and then murdering the fetus while the mother is screaming. There are literally no words in any dictionary to describe what they did. Story 6. Not necessarily ancient but the Iroquois. They had many rituals of torture for prisoners of war including ripping out fingernails / cutting off fingers, followed by forcing them to run the gauntlet, and then if they survived they would be scalped and burned alive. The real correct answer though is that every group of human beings was by our current moral standards absolutely brutal. Nothing the IRA hoisted here was unique or particularly worse than many other groups. I just haven't seen anyone mention them in this thread yet, so I figured I would. Story 7. Not sure if it counts as ancient or dug up, but there are indications that the Merovingians had some pretty interesting burial practices. There have been excavations where they found people surrounded by multiple heads, indications that graves were set on fire, indications of immobilization of the dead, hand and feet bound, for example, etc. In most cases the last example can be seen as merely a ritual thing, but in some cases excavators claim people were buried alive. There's also increasing evidence that these people reopened graves some time after burial to take bury exchange body parts and objects, kind of like the saints cults that took off a bit later in the same regions. Again, it's not really dug up in my opinion, because it doesn't harm living people, and I'm cautious about playing into the whole dark and violent Middle Ages thing, but it's definitely interesting and unexpected for most people. Especially since most high school classes depict the Merovingians as the first Christians in the region, and these practices definitely took place beyond Christianization in the area. Story 8. I know people wouldn't be surprised by hearing about the Aztecs due to their human sacrifice from war prisoners, but oh boy, it was way worse. If I recall correctly, there was a moment of betrayal that happened from, and I'm doing this from memory, they decided to break peace by killing a princess-like figure, by removing her beating heart, and when inviting her father to an ominous meeting showing a boy wearing her skin and clothes. Edit. For those in the comments trying to say this is a distorted view of Mesoamerican painted by the empires that crushed them, why can't you just accept that yes, their genocide is horrific, but they weren't angels either? It is not hard to see both things as horrible and disgusting. This very thread is proof humans everywhere can be horrible. That just makes them human. The Romans are looked up to this day for their achievements, and you still have Crassus making their soldiers collectively stab their own as punishment for losing to the slaves they would later crucify and torture. You have Japanese monks have a heartbreaking last stand with guns against their most famous conqueror, and you can still read sources about how they had a whole romance with preteen monks and prostitutes, which was seen as perfectly normal at the time. History is full of incredible people and incredibly horrible people. Story 9. Genghis Khan and the Mongolians of the steppe were absolutely ruthless and efficient. Entire unknown civilizations are reportedly wiped out by them with zero trace of their culture intact. Just fields of bones saying something big was there. There was at least one incident of a drunken Mongolian post-raid demanding a group of runaways remain still while he stumbled off to find his sword and kill them, and they did out of fear for what would happen had they not. There was an instance of a relatively small recon element of Mongolians who were sent over some mountains in modern-day Russia-ish region just to see what over there, stumbled onto an entire joint nation army and mersed them all, conquering the whole damn place. The Khans were a hard people. Oddly enough though, they were relatively progressive for their time. Once your people were conquered, they didn't really care what you did spoke believed, as long as you paid your tributes. They even protected from outside raiders. It's just ick now, the whole getting massacred and conquered part to deal with. Source: Dan Carlin's Hardcore History podcast, Wrath of the Khans and Memory. There was one instance of their unique brutalism that came back to mind. So being the progressive conquerors they were, they pretty regularly honored the beliefs and gods of their enemies. In one such instance they'd sacked and captured a host of nobles who believed it was unholy to spill high blood. In response, the Mongolians decided to honor their traditions and, rather than cut them to pieces, they laid the nobles flat, built a dancer floor on top of them, and partied like hell while the nobles were crushed underneath. No blood was spilled. Story 10. Samurai and feudal Japan. People like to imagine the samurai as some kind of noble order built around the belief that honor and service were to be held above all. Samurai didn't give half a sideways duck about the common peasant. They were a blue blood aristocracy that used their power and training to perpetuate a totalitarian regime that would make the House of Windsor blush. Some examples of the WTFness that people like to gloss over. Showing disrespect to a samurai was cause for instant death, and disrespect could be something as simple as not bowing low and long enough. Oh Mr. Rolled Rice Farm, does your back hurt from slaving in the field for your feudal lord? Well tough shit, I don't care how loud your spine cracks when you touch your head to the ground for me. If you twitch, that a beheading. The code of battlefield honor only really counted when the losing side put of just the right amount of fight. Not enough to be a problem, but you still had to do some pointless dying to keep from all being killed anyway. Example, Odin Abunaga committed a genocide against the IKKIK monks because they had the audacity to not insta-cave when he showed up. After several long sieges, he burned the hilltop fortress of Ishiyama to set fire to the mountain and blocked any escape, burning alive 20,000 men, women, and children. The idea that samurai hated firearms because they saw them as dishonorable or unsporting is bullshit. They hated them because they evened the playing field. Any peasant with an arquebus could kill any samurai before he even got his sword out, and that was not okay. They couldn't have their absolute martial superiority questioned, and especially by a weapon that didn't require years of special training, and more importantly, the free time to do that training, something your average rice farming peasant certainly didn't have. Ronin were not noble samurai seeking truth through walking the land, or whatever the duck people believe now. They were dispossessed lords who were now turning to banditry against any peasant who dared to not support them with free food and lodging. They were the equivalent of a former SEAL Team 6 member walking the road with his weapon, who will kill you if you don't buy his lunch, let him sleep in your bed, duck your wife, and then bid him adieu with a smile and call of thank you for your service. So yeah, samurai were aristocratic mass murdering assholes. Story 11. The ancient Phoenicians/Carthaginians had a child killing cult. They thought that their gods needed children to be appeased. Other Canaanite/Semitic peoples dropped this practice, depicted in the Tanakh, Bible's Old Testament, through the story of God sending a goat when Abraham was about to sacrifice his son. Although ancient Jews' annual ritualistic slaughter of thousands of animals is nothing to scoff at, murdering kids is obviously far worse. Even the Phoenicians' peers, contemporary cultures/civilizations of the period, thought it to be a barbarous practice. Here's Plato on the subject, with us. For instance, human sacrifice is not legal, but unholy, whereas the Carthaginians perform it as a thing they account holy and legal, and that too when some of them sacrifice even their own sons to Cronus, as I dare say you yourself have heard. In one notable case, during the late Sicilian Wars, Carthage itself was almost besieged and defeated. It got so bad Carthaginian civilians had to be pressed into the army instead of relying on their mercenary army. Carthage scraped by a victory at the Battle of White Tunis, but since it was so terrible, they thought the gods were punishing them. So in the aftermath of the battle, Carthaginian tried to appease the gods through, you guessed it, human sacrifice. 300 adults and 200 children were ritualistically murdered. Here is Diodorus Siculus describing the event. They also alleged that Cronus had turned against them inasmuch as in former times they had been accustomed to sacrifice to this god the noblest of their sons, but more recently, secretly buying and nurturing children, they had sent these to the sacrifice, and when an investigation was made, some of those who had been sacrificed were discovered to have been substituted by stealth. In their zeal to make amends for the omission, they selected 200 of the noblest children and sacrificed them publicly, and others who were under suspicion sacrificed themselves voluntarily, in number not less than 300. There was in the city a bronze image of Cronus, extending its hands, palms up and sloping towards the ground, so that each of the children when placed thereon rolled down and fell into a sort of gaping pit filled with fire. Story 12. Funnily enough, the Persian Empire was actually way better than it was portrayed. It was extremely open to different religions, and were very advanced in civil liberty. When you really look at it, the Greeks were kinda the baddies in the wars between these empires. Even Alexander basically said that after conquering Persia. But because we get a lot of our information about the classic period by Greek and Roman writers, Persia was seen as a barbaric tyrannical state. Story 13. What's always cooked my noodle is imagining all of the horrible, awful, no good stuff that went down before recorded history. The most ancient civilization we have information on, a fake, is the Sumerians. Also, supposedly the Egyptians are dated as far back as well 4000 BC. So 6000 years ago. That's all we've got of recorded human history. 6,000 years. Humans have been around for way longer than 6,000 years. The first modern humans, or Homo sapiens, date back 200,000 years. That's 33 times as long as recorded human civilization. Imagine the type of shit that went down. It wasn't just a bunch of random monkey looking people hanging out by themselves. They absolutely got banded up into tribes, and they went to war with each other. They could have built entire civilizations and burned them down repeatedly. 200,000 years is a lot of years to get up to shenanigans, and it's completely lost to time. Just poof, gone. As if it never happened. Which is honestly what will happen to all human endeavor. On the time scale of the universe, we're all just a fart in the wind. No one will remember squat about this period of human history 200,000 years from now. And what they do remember will be completely distorted from the truth. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more daily videos.